It was late October when I decided to go on a fishing trip that I would never forget. I had been fishing my entire life, and over the years I had grown comfortable spending hours alone by rivers, lakes, and even the occasional secluded pond. This time, I was heading to a remote lake deep in the Appalachian wilderness, a place I had visited once as a teenager but never returned to. They called it Dead Man's Hollow. The name alone would have been enough to deter most people, but I was drawn to the stories surrounding the lake. They said the fish there were larger than anywhere else in the state. They also said that strange things had happened there over the years, boats disappearing without a trace, fishermen who swore they heard whispers coming from beneath the water, and in one particularly chilling case, a man who went missing for 3 days, only to be found wandering barefoot in the woods, unable to remember a single detail about where he had been. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. I believed in facts, and the fact was that Dead Man's Hollow was known for having trophy-sized bass, and that was all the motivation I needed. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and set out just after sunrise. The drive took longer than I expected. The dirt road leading to the lake was narrow and overgrown, with branches scraping against the sides of my truck like skeletal fingers. I had to slow down several times to avoid potholes and fallen branches, and by the time I finally reached the small clearing near the water's edge, it was nearly midday. The lake was just as I remembered it, calm, dark, and eerily silent. Not a single bird called from the trees, and there wasn't even the faintest rustle of wind. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath. I unloaded my gear and made my way down to the shore. The water was so still that it reflected the overcast sky like a sheet of glass. I set up my rod, baited the hook, and cast my line, watching as the lure disappeared beneath the surface with a quiet plop. For the first hour, nothing happened. I sat on a fallen log, sipping from my thermos, and listening to the occasional drip of water from the trees. It wasn't unusual for fishing to be slow at first, especially in the cooler months, so I wasn't too concerned. But as the afternoon wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved me. It was the way the lake seemed to absorb sound, as though it was swallowing every noise I made. Even the splash of my lure hitting the water felt muted, almost like the lake didn't want to be disturbed. And then, just as I was starting to consider packing up and heading home, I felt it. A sudden sharp tug on my line. I straightened up immediately, gripping my rod tightly as the line pulled taut. The adrenaline hit me fast. This was what I had come here for, a real catch. Maybe one of those legendary trophy-sized bass that had drawn me to this eerie, secluded lake in the first place. I started reeling it in, but it wasn't easy. Whatever was on the other end of that line was strong, much stronger than any fish I'd ever hooked before. The rod bent at an alarming angle, and for a moment I was afraid it might snap. I planted my feet firmly in the soft, muddy ground and leaned back, using my body weight to keep control of the line. The fish, or whatever it was, fought hard. It pulled and thrashed beneath the surface, creating ripples that spread across the still water. I kept reeling, my hands aching as the reel squealed under the tension. My heart was racing, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. This was going to be the catch of a lifetime. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fight stopped. The line went slack. For a few seconds, I just stood there, staring at the water in disbelief. Had I lost it? Had the line snapped? I slowly reeled in the slack, half expecting to find an empty hook at the end of the line. But as I kept pulling, I realized that the line hadn't broken. Whatever I had hooked was still there. It just wasn't moving anymore. A cold, uneasy feeling crept over me as I continued to reel it in. The line felt heavy, like I was dragging something large and lifeless through the water. My pulse quickened, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A dark shape rising slowly toward the surface. At first I thought it was a log or a piece of debris, but as it got closer I realized it was something else entirely. It was a tarp. A large waterlogged tarp, tied up with thick frayed ropes. I stared at it, my mind racing. Why would there be a tarp in the middle of the lake? Why was it tied up like that? My first instinct was to cut the line and get out of there, but curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I pulled the tarp closer to shore. The smell hit me first. A foul, rotten stench that made my stomach churn. I gagged and turned my head away, but I kept pulling, dragging the tarp up onto the muddy bank. It was heavy, soaked through with water, and God knows what else. My hands were shaking as I reached for the edge of the tarp and began to peel it back. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a body, a man's body, pale and bloated from days, maybe weeks, in the water. His eyes were open, staring up at the gray sky with a blank, lifeless expression. His mouth was frozen in a grotesque grimace, as though he had died screaming. His hands were bound with the same thick rope that had been used to tie up the tarp, and there were deep, purple bruises around his neck. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I felt lightheaded, like I might pass out. For a moment, all I could do was stand there, staring in horror at the lifeless body lying in front of me. I needed to call the police. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, my fingers trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. But when I finally managed to pull it out and unlock the screen, I realized I didn't have any signal. Of course I didn't. Dead Man's Hollow was miles from the nearest town, and I hadn't seen another soul since I left the main road that morning. I had to get out of there. I had to get back to my truck and drive to the nearest police station. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the water. A whisper. I froze, my blood running cold. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe the sound of water lapping against the shore, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was a voice, a low, rasping whisper that seemed to be coming from the center of the lake. Help me. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the water, but there was nothing there. Just the same still, dark expanse of water stretching out in front of me. My heart was racing, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after the shock of finding the body. But then I heard it again. Help me! This time, the voice was louder, more insistent. It was definitely coming from the lake, and it wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a plea, desperate and filled with anguish. I should have run. I should have turned around, gotten in my truck, and driven as far away from that lake as I could. But instead I found myself walking back toward the water, as though I was being drawn in by some invisible force. Help me, the voice said again. And this time, I could hear the pain and desperation in every word. I stepped closer to the water's edge, my eyes scanning the surface for any sign of movement. And that's when I saw it. A pale, ghostly hand reaching up from beneath the water, as though someone was drowning and reaching out for help. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen in shock. The hand was barely visible, just a few inches below the surface, but I could see it clearly. It was small and delicate, like a child's hand. "Please," the voice said again, and this time it was right in front of me. That time I realized something paranormal things happening with me, and I just couldn't handle the pressure. And then I lost my sense, and then the next day I was founded by the side of this river. There are times in life when a single decision changes everything. You don't realize it at the time, of course. It might seem like an ordinary choice, a left turn instead of a right, a last-minute change of plans. But later, when you look back, you see how that one moment set everything else in motion. For me, that moment came on a cold, overcast morning deep in the Canadian wilderness. I had planned a solo fishing trip, a week of peace and quiet, just me, my gear, and the untouched beauty of the remote northern lakes. I had done trips like this before, though never this far off the grid. But that was part of the appeal. I wanted to disconnect, to leave behind the noise and chaos of the modern world, and lose myself in the wild. I had packed everything I thought I'd need, enough food and water for a week, a sturdy tent, a satellite phone, and my trusted fishing gear. My plan was to hike to a small, isolated lake I had read about in an old travel journal, a place so remote that it didn't even have a name on the map. The journal called it Mirror Lake, and the description was hauntingly beautiful. Crystal clear water surrounded by towering pines, with fish so plentiful that you could catch them with your bare hands. It sounded like paradise. But if I had known what was waiting for me there, I never would have gone. The hike took longer than I expected. The terrain was rough, the trail was barely visible, and by the time I reached the lake, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I was exhausted, but the sight of the lake took my breath away. It was exactly as the journal had described, still, pristine, and so clear that I could see the rocky bottom even from the shore. The trees around it were ancient and gnarled, their branches twisting together to form a dense, almost impenetrable canopy. It felt like I had stepped back in time into a world that hadn't been touched by human hands in centuries. I set up my tent near the water's edge, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. The air was cold and damp, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, but there was something about the place that felt off. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and jumpy after the long hike. But even as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dark, starless sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first day passed without incident. I spent the morning fishing and caught several large trout, which I cooked over the fire for lunch. The rest of the day was spent exploring the area around the lake, gathering firewood, and enjoying the solitude. By the time the sun began to set, I was starting to relax. That night, though, things started to change. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It was a soft, shuffling sound like footsteps in the dirt. My heart started pounding, and I lay there holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I waited, my ears ringing in the silence, but whoever or whatever was out there didn't make another sound. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next morning I found footprints near my tent. They weren't mine. They were smaller, like a child's footprints, and they led from the edge of the lake to the spot where I had been sleeping. I stared at them, my mind racing. There was no way a child could be out here, miles from the nearest town, with no sign of any other campers or hikers. It didn't make any sense. I considered packing up and leaving right then and there, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or maybe the footprints had been there when I set up camp and I just hadn't noticed them. I spent the rest of the day fishing and trying to distract myself, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. That night, it got worse. I woke up again, this time to the sound of whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but it was definitely there, a low, murmuring voice that seemed to be coming from the lake. I sat up, my heart racing, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The moon had risen, casting an eerie silver light over the water, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving out there, just beneath the surface. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care how beautiful the lake was or how far I had come. Something was wrong with this place, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the long hike back to civilization. But after about an hour on the trail, I realized something was wrong. The path had changed. It was subtle at first. Little things, like trees that looked different, or rocks that weren't where I remembered them. But the farther I went, the more lost I felt. The trail that had been so clear yesterday now seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make any sense, leading me deeper into the forest instead of back toward the road. Panic set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but every time I thought I was making progress, I ended up right back at the lake. It was like the forest was alive, shifting and changing around me, trapping me in a maze I couldn't escape. By the time the sun began to set, I was out of options. I was tired, hungry, and completely disoriented. I had no choice but to set up camp again, right there by the lake. That night, the whispering came back. But this time, it wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from the trees. And trust me, that time, I was totally tired and weak. I just closed my eyes, and then I don't know what happened, but when I woke up, I just discovered myself in a house where some people staring me curiously, and then one older man came to me and told me they were saved me from the lake. And after that day, I just never tell this story and never share this story with anyone. It had been a rough week. So when Saturday finally arrived, I decided to escape for a while. I packed my fishing gear, threw some snacks in my backpack, and drove out to a nearby state park. At first, everything was perfect. The trail was quiet. The sun was shining, and the crisp autumn air smelled of pine and fallen leaves. I followed a familiar path that wound through the woods and led to a small, peaceful river where I often fished. But when I reached the riverbank, I found it crowded with other fishermen. It was more than I could handle. I had come here for solitude, and the last thing I wanted was to spend the afternoon surrounded by strangers. Frustrated, I turned back and started walking, veering off the main trail in search of somewhere quieter. I had no destination in mind. I just wanted to get away. As when I found it, it wasn't visible from the trail, and there were no signs or markers pointing the way. I just happened to catch a glimpse of sunlight reflecting off the water through the trees, and curiosity led me the rest of the way. The lake was small, no more than a couple of acres across, and it was surrounded by thick, gnarled trees whose branches stretched out over the water like skeletal arms. The surface was perfectly still, like a sheet of glass, and the water was so dark that it almost looked black. It was beautiful in a strange, haunting way, and I felt an immediate, inexplicable pull toward it. I didn't think twice about setting up my gear. I found a flat spot near the shore, baited my hook, and cast my line. The lure disappeared beneath the surface with a quiet plop, sending ripples across the otherwise motionless water. I sat back and waited. The first hour passed uneventfully. There were no fish, no birds, not even the distant hum of insects. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, and even that seemed strangely muted, as though the lake was absorbing every noise. I was just beginning to consider packing up and leaving when I felt it. A sudden sharp tug on my line. I straightened up, my heart racing with excitement. Finally, some action. I tightened my grip on the rod and began to reel it in, expecting to feel the familiar resistance of a fish on the other end. But instead the line came back slack, as though whatever had been there had let go. I frowned, inspected the hook, and cast the line again. This time it didn't take long. Within minutes I felt another tug, stronger than the first. I yanked the rod back and started reeling it in, but once again the line came back empty. No fish, no bait, nothing. A sense of unease began to creep in. There was something off about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I cast my line a third time and watched as the lure disappeared into the dark, glassy water. And that's when I saw it. A ripple. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there, a small disturbance on the surface of the water, as though something had just broken through from below. I leaned forward, squinting at the water, but there was nothing there. Just the same dark, still expanse stretching out in front of me. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on fishing, but I couldn't. My eyes kept drifting back to that spot, and the longer I stared at it, the more convinced I became that there was something down there, something watching me from beneath the surface. I was about to reel in my line and leave when I felt it again, a tug harder than before. This time it felt different. It wasn't the quick, darting pull of a fish. It was slow, steady, and deliberate, as though something was dragging my line deeper into the water. A chill ran down my spine, and for a moment, I considered cutting the line and getting the hell out of there. But curiosity, and maybe a bit of stubbornness, got the better of me. I tightened my grip on the rod and started reeling it in, my hands trembling as I pulled. It was heavy, much heavier than any fish I'd ever caught before. I had to use both hands to keep control of the rod, and even then, it felt like whatever was on the other end was fighting me every step of the way. My heart was pounding, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps as I pulled the line closer and closer to shore. I had no idea what I was about to pull out of that lake, but I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't going to like it. And I was right. When it finally broke the surface, I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't even close. It was a boot. A single, mud-caked, waterlogged boot tangled in the fishing line. I stared at it, my mind racing. Didn't make any sense. How could a boot have caused that much resistance? And why did it feel like something had been pulling back? Before I could think too much about it, I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. There was something inside the boot. I leaned in for a closer look, my heart hammering in my chest. And that's when I saw it. A foot. A human foot. Pale and bloated, wedged inside the boot like it had been there for weeks. I stumbled back, dropping the rod and nearly falling into the water. My mind was spinning and my body was shaking so badly that I could barely stand. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and stare at that horrible, rotting foot. But before I could move, I saw it again, the ripple. Only this time it was bigger, much bigger, and it was heading straight for me. And I just wanted to run, but I didn't. Then I have lost my sense, and next morning I woke up and I just traumatized that time, and after that incident I got just sick, and it lasted 7 weeks long. And then slowly I recover from this.